No one expected this. Kevin Costner calls up the woman who saved his life. Imagine receiving a phone call from one of Hollywood's biggest stars, not because you're famous, not because you're wealthy, but because 23 years ago, you made a split-second decision that saved his life. The woman on the other end of Kevin Costner's call had no idea that her simple act of kindness on a rainy Tuesday evening in 1999 would come full circle in the most unexpected way. This isn't a story about celebrity glamour or red carpet moments. This is about how one ordinary woman's courage in an extraordinary moment created a bond that neither time nor distance could break. It's about the ripple effects of human kindness, the power of never giving up hope, and how sometimes the most important calls we make aren't to agents or producers, but to the everyday heroes who remind us what really matters in life. What you're about to read will make you believe in the impossible, question what you think you know about fate, and, perhaps most importantly, remind you that every single day, you have the power to change someone's world forever. Because sometimes, the person you save today becomes the person who saves you tomorrow. The rain hammered against the windshield of Maria Santos's beat-up Honda Civic as she drove through the winding roads of Malibu Canyon on that fateful Tuesday evening in March 1999. She was exhausted from pulling a double shift at the diner where she worked, her feet aching in worn-out sneakers, and all she wanted was to get home to her small apartment and collapse into bed. The radio crackled with static as she fumbled with the dial, trying to find something to keep her alert during the treacherous drive through the dark canyon. Maria had taken this route countless times over the past 3 years since moving to Los Angeles with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of becoming a nurse. At 32, she was older than most of her classmates at the community college, but she was determined to build a better life for herself and her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, who was back home in El Salvador with Maria's mother. Every penny she earned at the diner went toward tuition, rent, and the money she sent home each month. There was no room for luxuries, no safety net, just the grinding daily routine of work and study that she hoped would eventually lead to something better. The storm had been building all day, and, by evening, it had turned into one of those Southern California downpours that transformed normally dry creek beds into raging torrents and made the canyon road slick as ice. Maria gripped the steering wheel tighter as she navigated a particularly sharp curve, her headlights cutting through sheets of rain that seemed to come from every direction at once. She was thinking about the anatomy test she had the next morning, mentally reviewing the names of bones and muscles, when she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There, about 50 yards ahead, a car had gone off the road and was hanging precariously over the edge of the canyon, its front end suspended in the air while the back wheels spun helplessly on the muddy embankment. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, and Maria could see that the driver's side was smashed against a large boulder. Without thinking, she pulled over and grabbed the flashlight she kept in her glove compartment, a habit she had developed after too many late-night drives through unfamiliar neighborhoods. As she approached the wreckage, her nursing school training kicked in. She had only completed 2 semesters, but she had already learned enough about emergency response to know that time was critical. The car, an expensive-looking black sedan, had clearly hit the boulder with tremendous force before sliding toward the canyon's edge. Maria could hear the engine ticking as it cooled, and, somewhere in the distance, the sound of more rain-soaked earth giving way. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Even in the dim light and, with his face partially obscured by blood, Maria recognized him immediately. It was Kevin Costner, the actor whose movies she had watched countless times at the small theater in her hometown before coming to America. But celebrity status meant nothing in this moment. All she saw was a human being who needed help, and she was the only one there to provide it. Maria tried the driver's side door, but it was jammed shut against the boulder. She ran around to the passenger side, her feet sliding in the mud, and found that door slightly ajar. The smell of gasoline was strong, and she could see that the gas tank had been damaged in the impact. Every instinct told her to call for help and wait, but she also knew that the car's position was unstable. One more shift in the rain-soaked earth, and both the car and its occupant would plunge into the canyon. She managed to squeeze through the passenger door and immediately checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady. Kevin was breathing, but there was blood coming from his forehead, and his left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Maria had never been in a situation like this outside of her textbooks and practice scenarios, but she forced herself to remain calm and think through what she had learned about trauma response. The first priority was to stabilize the cervical spine. Maria carefully positioned her hands to support Kevin's head and neck, trying to remember everything her instructor had taught about spinal injury protocols. She could smell alcohol on his breath, and she wondered if he had been drinking, but that was a question for later. Right now, her only concern was keeping him alive until help arrived. But, as she reached for her cell phone to call 911, she realized with growing horror that there was no signal in the canyon. The storm had knocked out the nearest cell tower, and her phone showed nothing but empty bars. Maria felt a wave of panic wash over her, but she pushed it down. She was all Kevin had right now, and she wasn't going to let him die on her watch. The car groaned ominously as more earth gave way beneath the back wheels. Maria knew she had to get Kevin out of the vehicle before it went over the edge, but moving someone with potential spinal injuries was extremely dangerous. She had read case studies of people who had survived initial trauma only to become paralyzed because they were moved incorrectly. But she also knew that leaving Kevin in a car that was about to plunge into a canyon was certain death. Making a decision that would haunt her dreams for years to come, Maria began the delicate process of extracting Kevin from the wreckage. She used her jacket to create a makeshift cervical collar and then, slowly, inch by inch, worked to pull him through the passenger seat and out of the car. It took nearly 20 minutes, and, by the end, both of them were soaked to the bone and covered in mud. Just as she managed to drag Kevin to safety behind her own car, the black sedan let out a metallic shriek and slid over the edge of the canyon, disappearing into the darkness below. The sound of metal scraping against rock echoed through the night, followed by a distant crash that seemed to go on forever. Maria sat in the mud, holding Kevin's head in her lap, and realized that if she had been even 5 minutes later, or if she had decided to wait for professional help, he would be dead. She flagged down the next car that came along, a pickup truck driven by a local rancher who had a CB radio. Within an hour, paramedics and firefighters had arrived, and Kevin was being loaded into an ambulance. As they worked, one of the paramedics, a grizzled veteran named Chuck, pulled Maria aside. "You saved his life," Chuck told her, shaking his head in amazement. "That car went over just in time. Another few minutes and we would have been pulling a body out of the canyon instead of treating injuries. What you did took incredible courage." Maria watched the ambulance disappear into the night, its red lights flashing against the rain-soaked canyon walls. She had no way of knowing if Kevin would survive his injuries, and, in the chaos of the rescue, she had never given her name to anyone. She drove home that night thinking it was just another random encounter in a city full of strangers, never imagining that this moment would connect their lives in ways she could never have predicted. The next morning, Maria took her anatomy test with her hands still bandaged from cuts she had received while pulling Kevin from the wreckage. She scored 94%, one of her highest grades of the semester, though she could barely remember taking the exam. Her mind kept drifting back to those terrifying moments in the rain, wondering if she had made the right decisions, hoping that the stranger she had helped was somewhere safe and recovering. Local news reports mentioned that a prominent Hollywood actor had been involved in a serious car accident in Malibu Canyon, but no details were given about how he had been rescued. Maria saw the reports but said nothing to her friends or classmates. She was undocumented at the time, working under a false social security number, and the last thing she wanted was media attention that might lead to questions about her legal status. Meanwhile, in a private room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Kevin Costner was waking up to the news that he had suffered a concussion, a broken arm, and several cracked ribs, but that he was incredibly lucky to be alive. The doctors told him that if he had remained in the car much longer, he would have gone over the canyon edge and almost certainly died. They also told him that someone had pulled him from the wreckage before the car fell, someone who had potentially saved his life by making a series of difficult medical decisions in impossible circumstances. When Kevin asked who had rescued him, the doctors could only tell him it was a woman, probably Hispanic, who had disappeared before anyone could get her name. The police report mentioned a Good Samaritan who had stopped to help, but there were no identifying details. For Kevin, who had always believed that every person who touched his life deserved recognition and gratitude, this was deeply troubling. As he lay in his hospital bed, Kevin made a promise to himself. Somehow, someday, he would find the woman who had saved his life, and he would thank her properly. He had no idea that this promise would take him 23 years to fulfill, or that when he finally made that phone call, it would come at a moment when Maria needed saving just as desperately as he had that night in the canyon.